We want to principally examine you on that letter today. So we're going to talk about process. We're not going to talk about individuals. We're going to be talking about the process of government. If one reads the letter, and it's in the public domain, you seem to have a passion about ensuring that you get to the bottom of the issue of child abuse. You've used quite emotional and emotive language in this letter. Is it something that you want to see resolved finally and conclusively while you are Permanent Secretary?
Yes, Mr. Chairman, it is. I was at school during the era that we're referring to. People my age are the ones who've had their lives blighted by this. I was very moved by Tessa Munt's interview yesterday. I think many of you will have seen it. And I've talked to people who've said the same things, that they didn't know what to do, they didn't know who to turn to, they didn't know whether they could say anything, they didn't think they'd be believed, and so they stayed silent, and they just tried to move on, get on with their lives. And some, like Tessa Munt, have managed to do so with the support of friends and family, and others, of course, have always struggled. And as I said in my letter, as a citizen, as a parent, I still shudder when I think of this. I just do. But as a public servant, I think all of us, and you've made this point yourself, must be appalled at how the system as a whole, the state as a whole, failed its most vulnerable citizens. And we have to put that right. And a lot of what this Home Secretary's done, the sexual violence against the vulnerable, the violence against women and girls, the modern slavery bill that is on the floor at the moment,
Indeed,
is in that territory. So we do have to address this, and thank you, Mr. Chairman, for giving me the opportunity to make that point.
Let us look at the failures of the Home Office then, since you have correctly said that a lot of people have let these children down. The committee and I don't hold you responsible for the fact that this inquiry began only in February of last year, but in your letter you're very clear that as a result of the work of Tom Watson in particular, who the committee commends for all the work that he's done on this area, you initiated an internal review, even though in your letter you said this was in the public domain for about 2 years. So a year into this being in the public domain, you decided to do this. You commissioned your report, the inquiry, conducted by an unnamed individual who you have confidence in, without telling ministers, without asking ministers' permission, because this you regarded as your responsibility as Permanent Secretary. And it was concluded in June of last year. Is that right?
Yes, broadly speaking, Mr. Chairman, I would describe it slightly differently.
Okay,
of course, I informed. Yeah, I talked today with the Home Secretary. I told her of what my intentions were, and of course she, as she said in the House yesterday, supported the approach I was taking, but quite properly felt it was a decision for me rather than for her because of the nature of the investigation that we commissioned.
Because the criticism was about your officials and the way in which the Home Office had dealt with matters, not about criticisms of ministers. Is that right?
Well, it was more, Mr. Chairman, that Tom Watson's initial query to us was quite specifically about material from Geoffrey Dickens MP, the late Geoffrey Dickens MP, sent to the Home Office in the mid-1980s. And of course that relates to papers of a previous administration, so in any case I would normally be asked about the right way to proceed in answering a parliamentary query of that kind. And frankly, the normal way to proceed would be to do a file search against the terms that were there, probably respond fairly swiftly, and in this case, I would imagine, essentially have said that most of the information is no longer held. It was clear to me on the basis of the question that wasn't going to be good enough, that we had to look not only into the specifics that Mr. Watson had sought to ask us about, particularly the Geoffrey Dickens correspondence, but actually more broadly, because the primary purpose, Mr. Chairman, of what I was doing was not so much to respond to Mr. Watson, of course we had to do that, but it struck me that what we had to do was look through all of the Home Office files, all the material we retain, and see whether there was any material that was relevant to the ongoing police investigation.
Sure.
So the
but you left this very much... Excuse me.
Sorry, I'd finished.
You left this exclusively to the gentleman or lady who was conducting this review. And you don't wish to tell the committee who this was, but you have confidence in the abilities of this person.
Yes, I do.
And when the report was ready and published to you, and you passed it on to the police, did you tell the Home Secretary what was in the report?
So I shared with the Home Secretary the executive summary and the broad conclusions. I told her what we were doing with the material, But as she said yesterday, it wouldn't be appropriate for her, or indeed for anything other than a very small number of people, to have seen at least the sensitive personal information within the report. Indeed, I didn't even see all of the accompanying material myself. It wasn't appropriate.
Well, let's go to the Home Secretary's, what she said to the House.
Mr. Chairman, may I you just asked me about the investigator. I can
Yes.
just make a point here. Quite often these things are done within the department, and people here, we say the Permanent Secretary is doing an inquiry. I'm not a professional investigator, and it was quite clear to me I needed somebody to do this who had a proper investigative background, and who, particularly since they might have come across information that could have a bearing on criminal inquiries, would know how to handle that properly and how to handle any interviews properly. So that's why I wanted to bring in someone who was independent of the Home Office, hadn't worked in London, and had that professional investigative background.
But in terms of the Home Secretary, we'll be examining her next week when she comes before us. Did you say don't look at this report because it contains personal information, or did she say to you, I don't want to look at this report? And can you confirm that no special advisor or anyone else looked at this report except yourself and a few people?
So it was, I can confirm that. It was not the full details of the report, the full text of the report and the attachments were not shared with ministers or special advisors or anyone who didn't have an immediate need to see it. So that was myself and the people supporting the investigator. And we didn't have a conversation of the kind that you suggest, Mr. Chairman, because it was quite clear to me and quite clear to the Home Secretary the way we were handling this was the appropriate methodology.
And did you tell her that 114 files had gone missing?
I don't recall having that particular exchange, but of course, as you know, she would certainly become aware of that particular fact when we responded to a further follow-up question from Mr. Watson in the autumn of last
So
year.
that's the 13th of October. Sorry, the 15th of October when you replied to the PQ. 114,000 was not mentioned in that PQ.
No, in 114, sorry, not
Yes,
114,000. 100, you just said 114,000, Mr. Chairman.
114.
Before.
You're getting worried. You're getting worried.
114,000. Well, I'm concerned, frankly, about the 114. And I'm concerned about all material that we can't find.
So let's go back a second. Sorry, we're all concerned about it. That's why I asked you.
Yeah.
Did you tell the Home Secretary when you finished your report that 114 files, some of them which may have been relevant to the inquiry that you had asked an unnamed person to conduct, a report of which she never saw, but relied on your obviously excellent judgment in telling her that you regarded this as something that was a matter for you. You didn't tell her then that 114 files had gone missing.
I don't recall doing so, and I don't imagine I would. I went through with her the broad conclusions of the report and the broad process that we had followed, and of course the investigator concluded that he didn't believe that he hadn't seen any evidence that there was any material within the scope of his inquiry, so including those files, that had been inappropriately destroyed or removed. And so it was at that level.
Do you know who authorised the removal of these files or the destruction of these files?
No, I don't. And this is the issue with the 114, Mr. Chairman. Most of these files were probably destroyed because the kinds of topics that they covered would have been subject to the normal file destruction procedures that were in place at that time. But they can't be confirmed to have been destroyed because there isn't a proper log of what was destroyed and what wasn't.
And that causes you concern about the way in which the Home Office keeps records, I assume?
Indeed, Mr. Chairman. And of course, when I commissioned this review, and you'll recall Mr. Watson's question asked for copies of the original correspondence from the late Geoffrey Dickens to be placed in the library of the House. And I must admit, I presumed that we would be able to locate quite a lot of that. I assumed it would be possible to find that, to find the responses, and just be able to present that material. And I assumed there would be other material that would be relevant. So, of course, it's a matter of concern to me that that correspondence, we no longer have copies of that correspondence. The family, regrettably, no longer have copies of it, and therefore we're having to work from file references, files largely that refer to it, and descriptions of what happened, rather than the original source material itself.
Let me bring you up to date now. You wrote to us on Saturday night, and you said that you were appointing an independent legal figure.
Yes.
Do you have the name of that independent legal figure?
I do, Mr. Chairman. I'm pleased to inform the committee, we haven't put this out into the media yet, but I'm pleased to inform the committee that the figure will be Richard Whittam, QC. He's the first senior Treasury counsel for crime.
Is that an internal person from Whitehall?
No. So he's an independent QC. I mean, he's a Queen's Counsel. He still has a defence practice, but he also has a prosecution practice, and so Treasury counsel are essentially barristers. Some of you will be familiar with this. The barristers that the government engages. I think, for example, he prosecuted in one of the recent high-profile cases.
Right.
WHITTAM, Mr. Reckless.
But when you wrote to us, when you wrote to me on Saturday, and the rest of the committee, you said that it was the independent legal figure that was going to lead the inquiry. When the Home Secretary addressed the House yesterday, she sort of downgraded this independent legal figure and said she was appointing Peter Wanless. What happened over the weekend that caused this change of heart, your decision to appoint an independent legal figure to review the review, and the Home Secretary's decision to appoint someone else from outside Whitehall?
Well, I mean, essentially, this was a joint decision. I mean, I operate entirely under the authority of the Secretary of State, of course, except when there are specific issues that I have to deal with separately. And we concluded when we looked at this again after the weekend, we were preparing for the statement yesterday, and the big announcement, of course, of the overall inquiry, which, as you will now know, is going to be led by Lady Elizabeth Butler-Sloss.
Yes, that's been in the media already.
That's just been announced. That actually made sense for this second review to have a double independence. We'd always intended that there would be a child protection expert alongside. Once Mr. Wanless made clear that he was available, then it obviously made sense for the Home Secretary.
Well, you did make that clear in your letter to me. So you made the decision on Monday morning with the Home Secretary?
Well, there were further conversations over the weekend, and of course she made the decision and announced Peter Wanless yesterday. And so I think we mustn't worry too much about who's doing what. These are two very distinguished figures.
Of course.
This is the Wanless-Whittam review. They'll both bring this double independence to it: the independence of an experienced QC, and the independence of course, the CEO of the NSPCC, and I think they've both got unimpeachable reputations.
If this was left to the Home Office, rather than campaigning MPs like Tim Lawton, Simon Danczuk and Tom Watson, do you think you would be sitting in front of us today telling us about these two inquiries? Because it seemed that the Home Office, on its own volition, apart from your review last year, had taken no steps to examine any of these issues. Would you be sitting here today if it had not been for work that had been done outside government?
Well, I think a great deal of work and tremendous work has been done outside government. The Home Secretary paid tribute yesterday to various MPs for all of their campaigning work on this. But I think the Home Office and this Home Secretary have taken a lead as well. I mentioned some of the policy initiatives that she's led, and of course the decision to appoint the broader inquiry to look at the system as a whole and why and how it failed, and how do we ensure that we learn those lessons and therefore we can protect today's children, having failed to protect my generation, some of my generation's most vulnerable children. That was, of course, a Home Office and Home Secretary initiative.
Thank you. David Winnick.
As far as the process is concerned, Mr. said, well, can I just ask you questions regarding the information or allegations that Mr. Dickens sent information to the Home Secretary at the time? Now, would I be correct in saying that the Home Secretary, whoever the Home Secretary happened to be, and whichever party happened to be in government, would automatically take the documentation given to him? Presumably, the very fact that he had it would mean that the Member of Parliament, it would be a Member of Parliament, gave it to him, because otherwise he wouldn't have seen it in the first instance. But if it was the case that he did have this information given to him, would it be right to say that Home Secretary would pass it on immediately to his officials?
That certainly should be the case, Mr. Winnick, and as far as the independent investigation could tell, that was indeed the case.
Is there any possible doubt, whoever the Home Secretary was at any given time in these cases of historical abuse, is there any possible doubt at this stage obviously the inquiry will look into these matters further, as one would expect. But is there any doubt that the Home Secretary at the time acted in a way which was not appropriate?
Well, I would never go as far as to say there is no possible doubt, because that isn't, of course, even the legal test, Mr. Winnock. And the evidence, as we've just been exploring, is still quite patchy from that era. We don't have all the correspondence. So I think we have to be more cautious than the formulation that you have suggested there. And, of course, criminal investigations are ongoing, and I don't wish to prejudice any of those. They may have information that I'm not privy to, and you should obviously pursue that. But what the investigator found was that the Home Office at that time, the Secretary of State and the Home Office at that time appeared to handle the material appropriately, pass it on to the appropriate authorities. The exact formulation is the one in the executive summary and in my letter, and I mean, I can read that to you, but I'm trying to characterise it from memory, and that's probably the right formulation to use. I wouldn't want to go further than that formulation, because that was the formulation the investigator concluded.
Obviously, you were far removed at the time from the Home Office, but would you have expected that the Home Secretary, presumably, as I've said before, if he actually saw it in the first instance, it would have been given to it by a parliamentary colleague, otherwise he wouldn't see it, am I not right? It would go to the correspondence unit, private office or whatever, am I right?
Indeed, and that's what would happen now. So if we had an allegation now in a letter about, for example, child abuse in an institution, a school or a hospital or something of that kind, that would be passed straight to the police by the correspondence unit.
Yes.
And we do a quick reply to the individual concerned just to let them know that's what had happened. So you're right, that's the normal procedure.
Would you have expected the Home Secretary, in passing on the information, and the inquiry will demonstrate whether that was in fact the position or not, to give it to his permanent secretary or in a private office, or what would be the process now?
Now it would be handed through the private office straight into the ministerial correspondence unit, I would expect. It's quite rare for material to be handed over direct, of course, and therefore we don't have there isn't a standard procedure for it. But a minister who received correspondence of that kind now should hand it straight to their private office, who would hand it on either, if it was a policy matter, to that unit concerned, or in this case, in the case of if there were, for example, a specific allegation, of course they'd then pass it straight on via the unit concerned to the police.
Do you think there's any justification that some consider it rather sinister, and I'm using the word deliberately, not my view, but some might consider it sinister, that these 114 files which the Chair mentioned and which have been so much in the media have somehow disappeared, been destroyed?
The investigator didn't conclude that, and therefore I have no reason to think that. But, of course, as you have suggested, there is a lot of information missing from this era, not just the 114 files, but a lot of other information missing from this era, including the original correspondence from Mr. Dickens. Now, there's no evidence that we could find that suggested that had been handled inappropriately. But, of course, given the seriousness of these matters, it is very important that we don't jump to conclusions, and that the police can continue their investigations. They may have some of this material. They can continue their investigations to get to the truth. But
isn't this the sort of material that would be normally retained by the Home Office?
It would. So some material would, but most correspondence is destroyed. Actually, in this period, was destroyed after 2 years. Of course, serious material of the kind that we're referring to is handed on to the appropriate authorities. So it's not retained by the Home Office, but is handed to the criminal authorities.
And do you think that the inquiry will put much emphasis on trying to find out why these 114 files, which apparently contain names, allegations, possibly of parliamentarians, disappeared?
Well, I mean, that's a matter for the Wanless-Whittam review to look at. The investigator did look into that, and it's perhaps just worth noting that of the 573, I think, files that he was able to examine, there were only 13 instances of specific allegations, and he didn't find any evidence, admittedly indirect, of course, but any evidence that Mr. Dickens had named individual parliamentarians or indeed prominent public figures, nor was there any evidence from what Mr. Dickens himself said in Parliament through Hansard that he had done so. So I think one needs to be cautious about drawing that conclusion.
Do you think that it's been suggested by David Miller, as you know, a former Home Office Minister, not Secretary, there's a kind of witch hunt? Do you think there's any justification for Mr. Miller's comments?
Well, I think what is important is that there is a thorough, in fact, there are a series of thorough criminal investigations by the police that, even though it's 30 years later and much of the evidence will be difficult to establish, tries to get to the truth. There are almost 24 police investigations countrywide into serious child abuse in historic cases. I think it's vital that they seek to get to the truth and bring criminal prosecution.
And final question, Chair, if I may. Do you take the view that the sooner these investigations and inquiries take place, and perhaps the guilty brought to justice, if it's possible, and certainly the sexual abuse of children is one of the most monstrous crimes one can imagine, but some of these innuendos which are flying around and which names are being bandied around, in quite likely of innocent people, the sooner that ends, the better?
Well, of course, what I want is
a quick yes.
What I want is a successful conclusion to the criminal investigations. It's, of course, those are better handled if they're able to be pursued without lots of public comment. The police will be very, very careful about the information they release. But I think it's getting to the truth that matters.
Thank you. Colleague, I have all colleagues indicating they want to ask questions. So could we proceed first with Nicola Blackwood and then Michael Ellis?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Settle, obviously the Home Secretary yesterday also announced a non-statutory overarching inquiry. I think that everybody in this room will agree that too long victims have been denied the access to the transparency and justice, and this can have very long-term effects. I hope that in the process of setting up this inquiry and debating it, we're not going to be raising false hopes about exactly what such an inquiry can achieve after all that time. With that in mind, I just wanted to ask you a few questions about the establishing of that inquiry. The first thing I want to ask is the timetable for the inquiry. I know that the chair has already been announced, but
yes.
What about the rest of the panel members and the actual setting up of the inquiry and when they'll first start taking evidence?
So I met Lady Elizabeth Butler-Sloth this morning, and she's already absolutely onto this agenda. She recognises the need to proceed as quickly as possible. She wants to identify other panel members quickly and then get the inquiry moving. But as she said herself, she wants us to be left to do that, and she is not planning to make a lot of public commentary about the establishment of that until she's brought the panel together. The other thing she has said is she wants to confirm the final terms of reference for her inquiry once the panel is in place, so that she can seek their advice. But she wants to proceed promptly on it.
Will you be setting some kind of deadline, given the fact that expectations have now been raised? Victims are now hoping that they will finally reach some kind of resolution, that they will make some progress with cases which perhaps they've been pursuing for years and years. And if she's not planning to make any public commentary, perhaps if they know when they might hope to have an announcement, that might at least give some comfort. Well,
I must leave Lady Butler-Sloth the opportunity to make her own judgment about that. I mean, she's only just been appointed, as you know. I think everybody agrees, to go to Mr. Winning's earlier point, justice delayed is justice denied, and for many people, justice has been delayed for an entire generation. Her inquiry is not going to be pursuing individual cases. I'm sure she'll want to hear cases of that kind to help illuminate her work. But fundamentally, the purpose of her inquiry, as the Home Secretary set out, is to look at the systems and how did the systems fail these vulnerable children,
public bodies.
and indeed private and third sector bodies. It's fundamentally about that. So she will want to proceed promptly, I know. She'll want to do it thoroughly. I would expect that there would be some kind of report within a few months, but I think it would be too early for me to try and commit her to that at this stage.
A report within a few months?
Well, an interim report or an initial report. I would expect that she would want to make some kind of something within a few months, but I think that's very much for her to determine. The Home Secretary, I think, indicated some of this yesterday when talking about the timetable for this within the current Parliament. And I don't think it's right for me. I mean, I can use the exact same language. I wouldn't want to go beyond what the Home Secretary said yesterday in Parliament at this stage. It's only just the first few hours since we and the first hour actually since we announced Lady Butler-Sloss as the lead for this.
That's true. But in the points that you've just made about terms of reference and in the debate around the statement, there were some concerns that were raised about how a non-statutory body would compel documents and cooperation. There's one thing about compelling cooperation with the government, because the government's intending to cooperate with such an inquiry. Police cooperation is another matter, and perhaps you could give advice over what kind of level of police cooperation you think is likely to come forward. The next is local authority cooperation, given the number of care homes and other bodies which are likely to come into play in this inquiry. I wonder how you think the terms of reference can be set so that the inquiry can be just and effective and make any kind of progress at all.
So we're quite clear, the Home Secretary was quite clear yesterday, and I'm sure that the Chair of the inquiry, Lady Butler-Sloss, is the same, that we expect the full cooperation of all the bodies that she wishes to seek evidence from, and we will take action within government, national and local, to try and ensure that that cooperation is complete.
So at what point in this process, if such cooperation is not forthcoming, will the government consider triggering a full public inquiry? The door was left open for that in the event that this non-statutory inquiry is not seen as making the progress that is necessary to get to the bottom of the injustices which we've all sort of taken note of today.
So I think that would be primarily triggered on the advice of the inquiry panel itself. So Lady Butler-Sloss and her team would, if they considered it was necessary to convert, then of course that would be a very important moment. So I think that would be the primary trigger for it, and it might not be because of the particular circumstances you set out. But we do believe this is a very powerful institution that the Home Secretary has established, and in particular with somebody of Lady Butler-Sloss's reputation and track record. She ran the Cleveland Inquiry, she's participated in many others, and she is quite clear, she, Lady Butler-Sloss, and she, the Home Secretary, actually, are quite clear that they intend this inquiry to use the Prime Minister's phrase, leave no stone unturned, and so I am sure it will be thorough and complete.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm sorry, Mr. Sewell, I'm not happy about these 114 files, and I'm going to pursue some questions with you, and I'm going to ask you to be succinct in your answers and outline some of the issues about these 114 files as best you can, please. I've looked at the terms of reference for the 2013 review that you undertook into the child abuse files. One of the terms of reference is that an executive summary suitable for publication should be provided. Why not the whole report? Why should a summary be suitable for publication? What's meant by that?
Well, the whole report contains some sensitive personal information. We would have to redact some of that.
Why can't you redact names and addresses and keep the rest of it in?
Well, Mr. Rose, we are looking at doing that, but we want to be sure that all the material in the report that is relevant to the police, that was the primary purpose of this, none of that is compromised. But to be clear, the primary purpose of this inquiry was to find the evidence for the police. It was then to also, because it was prompted by Mr. Watson, to be able to answer the specific questions he raised, and that's what the executive summary of the interim report was designed for.
But it would inspire public confidence if the whole report, rather than if an executive summary, were to be published. And everyone, I think, would accept that names and addresses can be redacted.
Well, we suggested, I think, that the Wallace-Whittam review might oversee the work that we're doing to redact the full report so that it can be published.
Yes, thank you.
Can Mr. Sedlwell finish? Yes, Mr.
So it was always our intention that the report with suitable redactions might be published at some point. We released the executive summary at the appropriate time last year. We are looking at redactions now, and the Whittam-Wallace review can provide guidance to us on that.
Now, other files of a similar nature, and files relating to integrity of members of Parliament, historically, have been routinely copied, it's my understanding, by the security services in certain circumstances. So where you have found 114 files missing, has any search been made of the security service archive archive as to whether copies were kept 30 years ago of any of the material in question?
Well, not by me. A point I would make, and this came up in the House to some extent yesterday, is that I think all public bodies, particularly those in the scope of the Butler-Sloss inquiry, will be well advised to carry out a similar review of all the material they hold to the one that I commissioned last year.
Now, have you checked the Departmental Security Unit at the Home Office, as well as the Office for Security and Counter-Terrorism and other departments? Because I noticed from the report that the Central Home Office database is referred to.
Yes.
I'm presuming that there are other ancillary databases, and do you not think it would be a good idea for those that are not within the Central Home Office database are also checked, perhaps for copies?
So, Mr. Rose, if you look at my letter, it mentions 4 phases to the investigation. In my letter to the
We're talking about the new investigation now.
No. My letter to the committee that was about the investigation that was carried out. And if you look in that, the 4th phase was precisely that. So they looked at other material beyond the central database, including the higher classification material.
Right, thank you. Now, how do you know that there are 114 files missing as opposed to 112 or 201? How do you know that there's precisely 114 files missing?
So there are, as you'll see from my letter and as you'll see from the summaries, there's a total database of about 750,000 files. They ran a range of search terms across that database to try and identify the relevant and potentially relevant files. And some of that I've set out in my letter. I'll be brief, but I can come back to it if you wish. That identified the total number of files that were relevant or potentially relevant. 573 were still available to be inspected.
We have that.
In that search, 114 were identified that fell into...
Have you identified those 114 because you still have the titles of those files? The files have been lost or have been destroyed, but the titles of the files and their serial numbers still exist.
That's right.
Can you undertake to provide the titles of those files to this committee?
Well, I think what I would like to do is allow the Wanless-Whittam review to consider that. But I'm certainly open to releasing as much information of that kind as I can. As I think that, to be fair, and I'm grateful to the Chairman, I have tried to be as transparent as I can within the bounds of propriety.
I'm not saying otherwise, Mr. Sullivan. I appreciate that.
Absolutely take your point, Mr. Ellis, and we'll seek to do so.
The file titles may go some way towards clarifying the issue. To that extent also, I'm going to ask you about the file serial numbers. And I'm doing that for a reason. I appreciate that you may not have this information immediately to hand, but I'm presuming that if you have the file titles, you also have the file serial numbers. What would be interesting to know is to whether files within your registry, the Home Office, adjacent to the missing files, are also missing, that were on different subjects, not perhaps related to child abuse. So if file number 30 related to child abuse and is missing, or file number 29 and file number 31 relating to meetings with foreign countries or whatever are still present, that would imply, rather than incompetence 30 years ago, that a load of files have gone missing, that a particular file has been deliberately removed. So are the files adjacent to the missing files still present?
Mr. Ellis, I will have to take away. I don't know the exact methodology the investigator used to identify this, and I don't know whether the file references quite lend themselves to the inquiry. But let me take that away, and I will come back to you. I'll write back to the committee with an answer to that question.
Could you also ask to look at the registry index? Because my understanding is that there is an index of files. That index will have usually, in normal circumstances, indicated what happened to the file, whether it was destroyed or removed to another department or whatever.
Yes.
If the index is silent as to what happened to the file, that might indicate a sinister motive, or if it illuminates about what happened to the file, that might also be instructive. So perhaps the registry index will also be looked at.
Well, the registry index is how we identify the files, Mr. Ellis. But
why is it that you're not able to say whether the files were removed or destroyed?
Because that's the point. So not all of the files were held centrally, and therefore Some were there was a devolved approach throughout the department at that time to file management, and therefore central records on the central index, if you like, were not kept of whether every file was destroyed or whatever.
Let us be clear what you are offering this committee, and we're grateful for this offer. Though I don't see why this is not something you can do straight away. Have you seen the list of names of the missing 114 files?
I haven't, no, nor indeed the list of the 573 files the investigator.
No, I understand. I'm not asking about the others, but in answer to the questions that have been put to you, this is a very odd report that you commissioned, a report that the Home Secretary doesn't want to read. A list of files that you don't know the names of.
Sorry, it's not proper. It's not. It doesn't want to, Mr. Chairman, please. It's not. You know,
well, she doesn't want to read because it's not proper. That's perfectly fine.
But okay.
She's told us.
Are we wrong to mischaracterise it?
No, but we will see her next week, so we will ask her why she didn't want to read it. I'm talking about you now, Mr. Sedwell. You have commissioned a report which everyone says was done in good faith. A few people have read this report. It's not been put in the library of the House in a redacted form. There is a lot of concern over the 114 files. Not even you know the names of these files.
Mr. Chairman, no, because I relied on the judgment of the investigator, and the investigator concluded that there was no reason to believe those files were inappropriately handled. And as I said, the material that he did uncover in the 573 files that he was able to examine physically, he came across 13 instances of specific allegations, 9 of which had already gone to the police, 4 of which were quite ephemeral, and which we handed to the police when he discovered them. So I relied on his judgment of what was suitable.
I would have thought that, and this is not questioning your judgment, but well, perhaps I am questioning your judgment. I would have thought that if somebody came to you and said, as the permanent secretary of the Home Office, that there's 114 files missing, so I don't think that they were inappropriately destroyed, and I don't think they contained any information that was relevant, that I'd just say to them, well, can I just have a list of the names, as Mr. Ellis has just asked, so I can be satisfied that everything is in order. You've never asked for that.
No, I appointed...
Nobody's asked for that except today.
Well, look, we have that. We have that material was what the investigator found, and he handed all of that material over to the police.
So the police have it?
I was very well. The police have all the material the investigator...
So do the police have a list of names of the files?
I'll have to come back to you, Mr. Chairman, on the detail. You're asking me to go essentially beyond the material that I've already disclosed. I'll have to come back to you on exactly what he...
Not really. I'm just asking whether it's possible for you to write to this committee by Friday and you to yourself to look at that list. I'm even relying on your good faith, Mr. Sedwell. I think the committee want to know that somebody has looked at this list. At the moment, nobody's looked at this list.
Mr. Chairman, they have. The professional investigator I commissioned to do the work has looked at this list. And I realise your frustration, Mr. Chairman, but I am very clear in these circumstances. I'm not going to second guess. I'm not an investigator. I'm not going to second guess investigators. I brought him in. He was under the supervision of the Director of Criminal Investigations from Customs, under that professional supervision. I'm confident in the work that he did. It's not for me to second guess either the investigation or the conclusions that he reached.
This is becoming like a Jean Le Clair novel. You appoint someone to do an investigation which you say is a terrific guy or woman. They go off and conduct the investigation. You're asking a committee of Parliament to rely on your good faith in choosing this person and the report that they've written. And you're not telling us that when the report came forward and said there was 114 missing files, that you just asked for their titles. I'm not asking anything more. Would you go away and get this list and have it?
I'm happy to go and get the list, and if I can share it with the committee, I will. But you asked me whether I looked at the list itself, and the answer to that is I relied on the professional investigator.
But if you could do that and go and look at them and share it with the committee, we'd be most grateful. Could I have Lorraine Fulbrook, please?
Thank you, Chairman. Mr. Sedwell, can I ask, what exactly constitutes a file?
It may be something quite specific about a particular meeting that's been held or a very narrow policy issue, therefore may contain a very small amount of information. Or it may contain hundreds of pages of submissions and other internal material. It depends on the issue concerned.
So could we be talking about one file being a telephone call log, for example, and another file being a filing cabinet?
It's unlikely to be either of those, but there is of course a much there is a range. It's either to be either likely that big or that small, but there is files are done thematically by subject. So if there were a particular paper or meeting or incident that didn't naturally fit into some other piece of work, there might be a specific file open for it, and it could be a very small file. Normally, however, files will contain dozens of letters or
it could be one handwritten letter, for example. Could it be?
In theory, yes.
So
unlikely, but yes.
So of the 114 files, now my understanding is the Griggs system of archiving and disposal of files was introduced to the Home Office in 1982.
That's right.
And when did that system move on?
It was in 1999, I think, the late 1990s.
So, of the 114 files, so your commissioned report is from 79 to 99.
That's right.
So, of the 114 files, what preceded the Griggs system from 79 to 82?
There wasn't
in the case of archiving and disposal.
There wasn't as far as we know, there wasn't a sort of particularly organised system. The Griggs system was brought in across government, and filing in the Home Office before that period didn't follow a particular central common methodology all the way across. So, although there are flaws in the file record from the 1980s, the files further back are, if you like, even less structured than the kind of system Mr. Ellis was describing.
So for the first 3 years, there was no summary, if you like, of the titles of the documents that had been disposed of?
I don't know exactly what they found in the first 3 years. I know they looked over the entire period. The files existed before that. They did have titles. It's just that it was a different methodology for organising files. I don't know, Ms. Fulbrook. I can let you know whether there was a log at that stage.
So under the Griggs system from 1982, there was a summary log of the files that were being disposed across the department.
Yes.
So with 114, they could be bits of paper, for example, not necessarily files, lever arch files or filing cabinets. They all related between 82 and 99, did they? Or until the Griggs system finished?
No, I think I'll correct this in writing if I'm wrong, but it related to the whole period. So the central record database, the index, covers the entire period. It's just that the Griggs system was the filing sort of methodology for that period. I mean, for most of that period, but not for the first couple of years. But the index covers the entire period that they searched across. And they search on terms, I mean, it may be helpful if I just mention this. They search on terms, they search on Mr. Dickens' name and potential misspellings of it, on child sex abuse, on child abuse, on paedophilia, paedophile, etc., PIE, and variations of all of those words and others, in order to try to ensure that they identified from this 750,000 files that might be potentially relevant, and that was over the entire period.
So, on the Griggs system, after a 5-year period of the file is closed and then it's held for 5 years.
Yeah.
Before being disposed of on the first review, is my understanding.
So yes, some are a proportion of disposal on the first review, and then others are held back for a further review later. That's right.
So what closes the file at the first instance?
So a decision is so different people, I mean, and this has varied over the years. In this era, there were registrars in departments, individual departments around government departments, and they took the decisions on file management. So, if, as you suggest, there was a very specific piece of correspondence or incident or event that was being referred to in a file, then they might conclude, okay, that's closed, that's no longer a live file. In other cases, the file would be kept open because there was material.
On the second review, which would be 25 years later, is it not the case that a civil servant could decide, if they thought there was something damaging to them, to be allowed to destroy that file?
Well, there's a decision is
under the Briggs system.
So it is a civil service. I mean, there is a civil servant who would make that decision. But of course, it's most unlikely that there will be material in a file relating to that individual civil servant. But of course, no system is proof against some kind of inappropriate behaviour. We have people, and indeed take disciplinary action against people who, for example, access information they shouldn't get to.
But was it allowed under the Griggs system, on the second review, the 25-year review, that a civil servant could destroy something that they felt was damaging to them?
Well, it was not allowed, no. Absolutely not. So there were always policies around what material should be retained and what material should be destroyed, and civil servants are obliged to follow those policies, and no civil servant should ever have access to any material that relates to them or something in which they have a personal interest.
Thank you.
Can I just ask one
Yes,
final
one final
question?
question.
Nowadays, in the current system of archiving and disposal of files, there is a summary of what is being destroyed, for example,
Yes.
and we wouldn't have this situation in the future.
I would hope not. I mean, I would. The systems these days, partly because they're digital, of course, are more robust. Much of the problem we now face actually is the volume of information and the unstructured nature of much of the information that we deal with in the modern era. But of course, it is. There is always a digital footprint. So, if, for example, I commission an internal investigation, leak inquiry, or some disciplinary inquiry, even if someone has deleted an email, there will still be a trace of that email on the central archive. So it's a very different system in the digital area.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Before I call Mr. Austin, you said in your letter that there were 4 cases involving Home Office officials
Yes.
that had been referred to the police. Is that allegations of child abuse or inappropriate use of files?
No, so those were cases. There were 4 Home Office personnel. I think this is at the end of this period, because we actually did extend the file search. The investigator extended the file search beyond the end of this period. There were 4 files relating to Home Office personnel. The police had drawn them to our attention. They were being investigated and then in the end prosecuted and convicted for inappropriate pornographic images and material of that kind, and were dismissed. So it was the other way around, if you like. This was the police.
How many Home Office officials have been dismissed for inappropriate use of files?
I would have to come back to the committee on that.
Thank you, if you could do that. Mr. Austin.
Thank you. I'd like to ask some questions about the reporting to the Peterborough Information Exchange.
Yeah.
On section 4.2 of the report, it says that the head of the Voluntary Services Unit left the Home Office in 1983. Can you tell me why he left?
I would have to come back to Mr. Austin. I don't know.
Okay.
And of course, I do. There is a duty of confidentiality to the individual. So,
Okay.
again,
Well, if you'd like to tell us, if you could come back, that'd be
I
great.
will come back to you.
The report says that the senior investigator, quote, heard information from former employees that vouched for the individual's integrity and presented a view that they would not knowingly supported or facilitated the alleged funding to PIE. Is that, presumably you share that?
Well, I draw my. I mean, this is a long time, of course, before I was even in government. But I have no reason to doubt that conclusion.
Okay. Do you know how many former employees were asked and what position that they held?
I don't.
Are you able to tell us that?
Again, I need to be careful about getting too far into all of the details of these individual reviews, but if I can share any further information, I'll
Fine. And if you can't, you'll tell us why?
Yeah.
Fine. Okay. The head of the VS, the Voluntary Service Unit at the time, that mentioned, that was Clifford Hindley.
I think that's right, yeah.
Yeah, okay.
For some of this period.
And in paragraph 7.5, you say that it's the reasonable conclusion of the senior investigator, taking all the facts into account, that on a balance of probabilities, the alleged funding from the Voluntary Service Unit to PIE did not take place. But would it not be equally reasonable to conclude, given the information that isn't available, that funding might have been provided but the evidence has since been lost or destroyed.
That was the conclusion that investigator reached, and again, I have no reason to doubt it. Financial information is actually quite difficult to completely remove, because we retain, and indeed Hansard retains, of course, published details of Home Office accounts, and there's quite a lot of the information in there. So he found no evidence that the Home Office had directly funded the VSU, and no evidence that the funding to these other institutions who had some links with the PIE. Sorry, I said VSU before. I meant PIE. Sorry. That funding had been diverted to it. Okay. So I think it is most unlikely that it would be possible to hide a funding trail, because government generally has a very tight audit on where its money goes.
Tighter now than perhaps it did then, but the inquiry came about, I think, because Tom Watson put forward the name of a retired Home Office worker who claimed to have seen a submission suggesting funding for PIE. How many times did the senior investigator interview, or did the senior investigator interview that Home Office, the retired Home Office worker, as part of the inquiry?
Again, Mr. Watson, I don't know, it's not really appropriate for me to get into the detail of how an investigator proceeds. The Wanless Whittam review. Well, my point, Mr. Austin, is this: I don't want to prejudge the Wanless Whittam review. I'm being asked to make quite a lot of comments on the reviews we conducted. I have confidence they were done professionally.
Okay, let me put it another way.
But the Wanless Whittam review will look at all of this and give us an authoritative answer.
Okay, a Member of Parliament made an allegation. A review was launched to look into that.
Yeah.
I'm surprised to be told that that review didn't interview the retired Home Office worker who claimed to have seen the submission suggesting funding for PIE. I mean, that would seem to me... this person... it's not much of an investigation, it seems to me. Can you shed any light on as to why that's the case, if it is? Well, and if you're not able to, could you write to us and tell us why?
Well, I think Mr. Austin, look, the answer to that is... this
investigation happened this year, didn't it?
Yes, it did.
Right.
And as did the other one last year. But the point I'm making is the point I've made several times. I'm not an investigator. I don't consider myself professionally qualified to second-guess the judgments of individual investigators. I'm sure that as one looks through these reports, one can say, well, could this have been done? Could that have been done? Should something have been done differently? The reason I brought in professional investigators to do these things was to allow people who actually have experience to do it. Right. And the Wanless Whittam review will give us the authoritative answer as to whether the procedures they followed were appropriate.
Okay. Well, I'm asking you if you can find out, because I'm told that the investigation into what that retired Home Office worker had claimed didn't actually interview the retired Home Office worker, even though it was his claim that triggered the investigation. So I'd like to know whether that's true, and I'd like to ask if you're able to tell us that. Can I? Do you know whether the senior investigator, so-called, was aware of Clifford Hindley's published works? For example, was he aware that Clifford Hindley cited in a biography of Benjamin Britten for making a study of, quote, aspects of ancient Greek pederasty?
Again, Mr. Austin, I don't know, you're asking me...
Well, it was a report to your department.
Well, I know that, but...
And if I can get this information, you could have done...
Mr. Austin, you're asking me to second-guess a professional investigation. Well, you're asking me to tell you what the investigator did and didn't.
Look, I'm not a senior...
I don't know.
I'm sorry, I'm not a senior investigator. I've got no investigative background. I'm able to establish this stuff. I think your investigation conducted by your senior investigator ought to have been able to do the same.
No,
anyway, look, if you
Mr. Austin, you're saying because I don't know the answer that none of this was... No. You're saying because I don't know the answer to your question about...
Commission the inquiry?
Yeah, but you're asking me to know exactly... What you're asking me is whether I know every single procedure that the investigator took You're giving some examples about whether he did certain things. Of course I don't know that. That's for the investigator himself. I'm not saying he didn't do any of the things you're suggesting. I'm just telling you I don't know, because that's why I appointed an investigator.
Okay, well, I'd like you to find out. Yeah, but I've got one final question, if I may, Chair. The payments to organisations from the Voluntary Services Unit, presumably they would have required ministerial sign-off. Are you able to tell us which ministers would have approved the funding?
So funding of that kind would normally require ministerial approval. Again, I can see whether we can find that out. I don't know whether those papers still exist.
Well, I think it would be very helpful if you could provide us with any submissions and notes of meetings relating to any funding recommendations from the Voluntary Service Unit during this period.
I will do what I can.
Okay, thank you.
This at the end, shopping list at the end, if I can.
It's fine. My staff are taking it over.
I think I may prefer my notes, considering we'll have lost 114 files.
Well, Mr. Chairman, as you know, I'm establishing a practice, at least on this issue, of not only answering your questions, but trying to provide information beyond that as well.
You have, and we're very grateful, and I have thanked you for that. Dr. Hubbard.
Thank you, Chair. Three hopefully brief questions.
I'll try.
The first one is just to understand a bit more about the files. What exactly is known about them? You imply you don't know how large they are, but is anything known about dates, anything else, or is it just the titles alone?
I'd have to come back to you. I think there is some basic information kept about the files. So as Mr. Ellis was suggesting earlier, there's some file references, titles. There would be, I would imagine, some date information as well. But it is essentially just an entry on a database, because that's what was revealed by the file search. And then, as we've established, it hasn't been possible to find the physical files themselves, or, and in most cases, we think were probably destroyed.
I bet just because it might be quite interesting to know whether they cluster at particular times, or if there is any. I mean, I would have thought a database would say something about how large it was, but maybe I'm wrong in that.
I think again, this is. I mean, and I think I realise what I'm reaching for, because it's essentially the same point as Mr. Ellis. Is there something untoward or suspicious in the essentially the pattern of the absences? And that is something the investigator looked at. But that's clearly a judgment again that the Wallace-Whittam review must make. I wouldn't want to try and put my own judgment on that, not least because this committee quite clearly, and I, want to be sure that these are independent judgments that are being made.
So maybe just quickly then, as you mentioned it's the Wallace-Whittam review. Mr. Whittam is security cleared to the highest levels, I think he says in his descriptions. I don't know about Mr. Wanless's security clearance. Will they be allowed to have a look at absolutely anything that they wish to look at, or will there be some things that they may not look at?
My intention is that they can see everything they wish to look at, and I wouldn't expect any objections either from, certainly not from within the Home Office, because that won't happen, nor from anywhere else. So yes, is the short answer.
Thank you. Then just one final question, both at the time and now. Who can order a file to be destroyed?
I mean, files are, it's not essentially an order in quite the way that maybe the question is designed. So there isn't a process by which it comes down from ministers or Permanent Secretary or anyone of that kind. These are done, this is a professional duty on the registrars. And they, against a policy that's set out, the grid system during this period that Ms. Fulbrook was asking about, determine whether or not files merit destruction. So it's an entirely professional procedure in that way.
So there is nobody other than a registrar who could get a file destroyed, no matter how they try.
I mean, the system has changed over the years, so we no longer have distributed registrars in quite the same way. But there are policies that people have to follow. So if, for example, you're asking, could I issue an instruction to say, remove this or remove that? At the very least, there'd be an audit trail of that, and I'd have to be accountable for the judgment I'd make.
So whoever deleted these must have been a registrar. You're saying there is no possibility that somebody else could have done.
Mr. Hubbard, the one absolute in this is that I'm not going to make absolute assurances because I simply can't. We're talking about a long time ago. We're talking about procedures that, as we know, are deficient in significant respects. The reason we've had so much time on this is because we don't know properly that the 114 files were properly handled, and indeed there are others recorded across the entire file log as well. So I can't give you an absolute assurance. I can tell you what should have happened, and I can tell you that files are only to be destroyed according to policies and procedures that are set out at the time and, of course, change from time to time over the years.
So, to say that your personal attention has been more on the Home Office review of lost files and less on the wider non-statutory inquiry.
I think, I mean, over the last period, yes, but essentially, as permanent secretary, I'm as involved in policy as I am in process. So I wouldn't say it's more one than the other. But of course, the internal review was a piece of work that I commissioned, and therefore, obviously, gave it my attention.
And the external inquiry, if I may call it Home Office, the lead department for that, and you take sort of responsibility for supporting and facilitating.
Yes, indeed. So we'll provide whatever secretariat support and other expert support. We'll liaise with other government departments to get to the point that Ms Blackwell was asking about earlier, to ensure that they provide all the information the inquiry wants. So yeah, we're very much going to support the inquiry's work.
And earlier you exhorted other public bodies to search and share relevant documents. Would you include in that the Government Whip's office?
Well, in fact, I meant when I said that to refer to the comment you made in response to the statement yesterday. I think all bodies who may have information, either as I was seeking, that may be relevant to criminal investigations, or that may be relevant to the Butler Sloss inquiry, should carry out the kind of exercise that I carried out last year with proper independent scrutiny, and provide that information as determined. So I'd extend this to all bodies.
And if you're looking at an isolated sort of file or documents, even a few files, you wouldn't necessarily know if they were going to be helpful to a particular police inquiry if you hadn't been informed of that inquiry. So would you therefore encourage such bodies to share any potentially relevant documentation with the Butler Sloss inquiry, at least in the first instance?
So either that, or if it relates to specific allegations, then with the police. And so most of the material we've shared is, I think, what the police might regard as intelligence that might just support an inquiry they're pursuing. I don't know what other information they have available to them, of course. And of course, we'll respond to any further inquiries they make, and I would encourage others to do the same. So if it's specific with the police, if it's more about systems and process, then with the Butler Sloss.
And for the police, I think there are concerns as to how linked up those police intelligence systems are, and particularly inquiries that there may be links that the relevant forces don't know about. Can the Butler Sloss inquiry be a sort of point of contact for sharing that information to ensure that sort of dots are linked up that may not be done currently?
Well, I think in terms of the individual criminal investigations, again, I would say that the best, and I think this would be their view, but obviously it's for them to decide. I think the best route would be into the police. The police are working to deconflict the various investigations that they have going on across the country to ensure that there aren't overlaps or gaps between their investigations. And so it should be possible if material that, for example, I or another institution, mine or another institution thought was relevant, was handed to a particular police force, they should be able then to judge whether or not that it might be relevant to another police inquiry, for example, because they would be privy to that in the way that outsiders like us would.
You're referring to registrars and changing policies for authorising document destruction. Are there sort of protocols and guidelines that apply across government in terms of document destruction?
Yes, so the GRIG system was a system that was a government-wide system, and the National Archive now essentially set the overall policy parameters, although obviously different departments will have different immediate procedures, but fundamentally it's a common system.
And should the Government Whip's office be compliant with that cross-government protocol and guidance?
I think, Mr. Rector, that you're taking me beyond my competence.
Well, Mr. Settle, who else can I address these questions to? You've just said at the beginning of my questions that you and the Home Office, you're the lead in terms of facilitating this. If you could advise me as a parliamentarian how the Whip's office can be required to answer that question in the same way before a select committee, I'd be grateful if you would.
Well, I don't know enough about how the Whip's office manages its information, frankly, to give you a very intelligent answer.
Can I just give you one input into that before you answer then? An ex-whip wrote about 1996 that there was a dispute within the whip's office whether notes for whips were the personal property of the whip concerned or government property, and it's in response to that sort of concern that a new policy in terms of document shredding was instituted. And I would just like your answer as to whether that policy, ideally what it is, but whether it's compliant or should be compliant with the government protocols.
Well, the Home Office has got the lead for supporting the Butler Sloss inquiry, because I don't have the lead for the overall file management systems across government as a whole. And I simply am not familiar enough, Mr. Reckless, with the procedures in the Whip's office to say very much. I think it really is a matter for them and the.
Would you encourage them to share those procedures?
But as I've said, I would encourage all institutions, including all government institutions, including, as I said, I did mean to refer to your comment, to put themselves in a position to share information with the police and share information with the Butler Sloss inquiry. And I think all institutions should do that.
Including to state what their document destruction processes are, how those have changed, and in particular the reference I made to 1996, the question I have is, does that apply to historic documents? Were they all shredded at a point in time? Should we get the answer to that?
Well, again, Mr. Reckless, I don't really want to tell this committee what questions you should be asking and who you should be asking them of. I don't think that's proper for me to do. But of course, you're
and you think we should have someone in? Please tell us.
Well, I think Mr. Reckless is clearly pursuing a line of inquiry here that he's interested in. I think the committee must make a judgment about that. But to be clear, I don't want to sound evasive. It's just that this is outside my department. And I can only really answer.
You are the lead department for these inquiries.
Well, for the inquiries, but that's why. But
you said the inquiry should consider these matters.
Indeed, but this is then a matter for the inquiry themselves about how they wish to do so.
But you don't wish to tell us about the mechanisms.
I don't know enough about the mechanisms, Mr. Chairman.
But you have agreed it would be useful for those mechanisms to be shared.
Again, I think all of this kind of information, there's no reason it shouldn't be transparent.
Thank you. My final question, Mr. Sedel, do you pivot between instructions from ministers and the long-term interests of the Home Office?
Do you know, that was the first time I'd seen that phrase when I read it in the media this morning. My job is to deliver this Home Secretary's agenda right to the last day of this Parliament. Of course, part of that agenda is to ensure that the Home Office is in good shape to deliver not only her agenda but her successor's agenda into the future, and that's the way I would describe my obligations to her as my Secretary of State.
Thank you.
That sounds extremely loyal. I support that. Paul Flynn.
Those of us who were in Parliament with Sir Geoffrey Dickens are glad to see the tributes being paid to his courage, and he is persistent in these cases, and he certainly did a great job in exposing a number of paedophiles. You mentioned in your letter another aspect to his complaints, which involved the occult and alleged satanic practices. And as I recall, very few of those had a very sound basis in the complaints. Is it possible that there might be an innocent explanation for the missing files in that they were not regarded as being worthwhile and they haven't made complaints that stuck?
I think that's right, Mr. Flynn. It's difficult for us to reach a judgment, but I think you're right to suggest that we shouldn't assume there's anything sinister. The investigator did not find any evidence to suggest that there was. He said he found no evidence that the destruction of files, including of the 114, was inappropriate. It's phrasing it slightly differently, but essentially I'm endorsing your point.
Following up the points that Mr. Ellis made, I think many of us have been very surprised knowing the level of security clearance is necessary if we employ a worker here in this House, that there seems to be an absence of activity from the intelligence service about many of these famous paedophiles who were very indiscreet and been active in the paedophile activities over many years. I mean, have the intelligence services been reporting on prominent figures who are in danger? Are they doing it now? Will they be doing it in the future?
So the primary function of the intelligence service, of course, is national security. So this is really a function for the police rather than the intelligence services. And as you know, Mr. Flynn, I can't be drawn into commenting on exactly what either the security and intelligence services do. But just to answer your point, that's primarily a matter for the police rather than other national security agencies.
But it's looking into the future, and I think we've all been thinking about how we're going to avoid what's happened in the past.
Yes.
And the least satisfactory way of getting information is for MPs who may or may not collect information and send it in. But when we look back on Sir James Savile, the fact he was knighted, that he went to 11 New Year's Eve parties hosted by Margaret Thatcher, and that he had, and he was a great trusted friend of royalty. Now, should somebody who was in potentially a position there where there were security implications, isn't those cases, and Sir Cyril Smith, again, honoured by the country, I mean, shouldn't the job of the security service, I think anyone else can do it properly, to report when there are people of grave danger, at least to stop their activities in their lifetime?
Well, Mr. Flynn, I think all of us would agree that there were many failures throughout the systems, the healthcare system, the police system, and elsewhere, which permitted Jimmy Savile, Cyril Smith, and others to pursue their activities. The vetting service is not actually run by the intelligence agencies. There are vetting services. The Foreign Office runs one, and the Ministry of Defence runs another. And of course, good security vetting should be able to identify this. But there have been many lessons learned since that period. The Police National Database of Intelligence Material, for example, was established partly in response to failings of the kind that you have set out. But I think it's really for the Butler-Sloss inquiry to determine what those broader system lessons are for us. But I absolutely endorse the approach you set out.
Quick contributions from Yasmin Qureshi and Nicola Blackwood as a supplementary. Yasmin Qureshi.
I just wanted to ask, the investigator, did he, I may have missed this, did he actually speak to the Home Office official who had left the Home Office and who said that he'd actually handled those files?
Sorry, are we... which investigation? These are two investigations, sorry, Ms. Qureshi. No, but there were two investigations. There was the first investigation into which did the file search and looked at the paedophile Jeffrey Dickens work, and then there was the second investigation, a separate investigator that Mr. Austin was asking about, which related to the funding of the...
I think it's the mystery man who did the first investigation, Mrs.
So he did not interview former ministers or officials. It says that I said that out in my letter. And that's partly because, again, we have to be very careful given that there are still ongoing criminal investigations.
Thank you. And Nicola Blackwood is a very quick supplementary.
Thank you. I just wanted, Mrs. Cyril, you to help me understand a couple of your answers to Mrs. Fulbrook on understanding what the contents of the files were. It seems to me that, other than the name of the file possibly, you have no idea what the contents might be. And I just wondered if there's any way to trace cross-references in any other files to these ones, because if there is no trace of cross-references, that does appear to be somewhat sinister, does it not?
So file titles give some indication of the subject matter. I mean, it says they're supposed to be intuitive. They've become more so over the years, to be frank. But there is material in other files that is relevant. So we weren't able, for example, to find a file with all of Mr. Dickens' original correspondence in, but there were then other files which contained, letters referring to that or responses. So there are. So that formed the basis of the material that the investigator.
And has that built up a picture of the contents of these files and the nature of their contents?
Well,
what they say.
It is again without wishing to go into what the Wanless Whittam review will do. It was on that basis that the investigator, on the basis of the material that was available to him, that the investigator reached the conclusion that he did not see any evidence of inappropriate removal of material, including with these 114.
Now, you said that in the first instance there were no interviews of Home Office officials.
No, of former ministers and officials.
Former ministers and officials. But in the Wanless Whittam inquiry investigation, will there be interviews of officials, and will you be able to narrow down those who might have had access to these files so that you can gain a fuller picture of what might have happened and what their content might have been?
So that will be a matter for them, and that is really one of the reasons that that there is a QC involved in this. But they will be, of course, subject to the same boundary where they don't wish to
compromise
even inadvertently disrupt an ongoing criminal investigation. But of course, the police have the names of all the officials that we could identify as having been responsible for this correspondence with Mr. Dickens, responsible for the material at the time, and therefore we're leaving to the police whether, presumably on the basis of other information they may have that I'm not privy to, they wish to interview any of those individuals. That's really a matter for them, I think.
Final question on the Butler Schloss inquiry. I understand that most of the terms of references and mechanisms are not to lead to her. However, there has been raised a concern about retired police officers and concerns that they may have regarding pensions if they've signed gagging orders or are subject to the Official Secrets Act. Now, this may not be something that the panel can solve by themselves, and I'd just like an assurance that the Home Office will do whatever they can to enable testimony from former police officers to come forward to the inquiry.
To be clear, the short answer is yes, but to be clear, there is no confidentiality clause, or gagging order if you prefer, confidentiality clause, or indeed the Official Secrets Act, that obliges you not to reveal information about a criminal act. Indeed, quite the reverse is true. It would be completely unlawful for somebody to impose a gagging clause of that kind, and everyone needs to remember that every member of the public has a duty to cooperate with the police if they have information about a criminal act, even a criminal act 30 or 40 years ago.
Thank you, Mr. We're going to conclude now, because I know you have to be away and the committee has other witnesses. But you talked about lessons being learned. You've probably seen today's Ombudsman's report. It's a damning report into the way in which the Home Office dealt with an immigration case. You've now paid out £120,000 to the so-called Crossbow stalker. And it's interesting that what the Ombudsman said is the Home Office in effect lost the complainant's 2 follow-up letters following a failure to act on information that she sent in to stop this man entering the country. He then stalked her with a crossbow, tried to burn down her house, and this is all really failure from officials to follow up on complaints. It sounds very similar, though it's a different subject matter to what you've had to deal with. How are you going to stop this culture that seems to pervade the Home Office at the moment?
Mr. Chairman, I'm grateful to you for raising it. This is an appalling episode, and I've written to the family to apologise. I've offered to meet them, and we have provided, as you've acknowledged, compensation to them, as the Ombudsman has suggested. And this simply shouldn't have happened. That is quite clear, and the Ombudsman's report makes that clear. And I apologise again to the Hewitt family for the distress they suffered as a result. This was a case of maladministration. That was a failure by, at the time, the Border Agency, but that's part of the Home Office. I'm not going to logic chop about that. It was a failure by the Border Agency to follow up information properly. There are recommendations in that report, and we are acting on all of those recommendations. Indeed, some of that change is already in place. We're acting on all of those recommendations. And just very briefly, so for example, I've strengthened our internal audit function anyway, aside from this report. I've now appointed a Director of Risk and Compliance within the Home Office, the kind of role that you would have in a city firm or a bank or something of that kind, to try and strengthen our understanding of and illumination of the risks that exist within the Home Office and therefore the risks that we let individuals down.
Concluding on the child abuse issues, do you think the police should have more than the 7 officers they have at the moment to investigate? Because it seems like a very small number if you look at some of the other investigations they've been involved.
Well, there are investigations, of course, across policing. So, as I mentioned, there's something like 24 investigations. It's in the end an operational judgment for the police. I'm not really qualified to make a judgment. It's for them. But they know how serious this is, and they know that they will need to deploy the resources to try and bring the guilty to justice.
You're the first permanent secretary to have initiated an internal review. You've got many predecessors who've had the same information, but none of them did what you did. So it may mean that you find that we are ungrateful, having started the investigation, the review, that it's ended up in this current state, and we've asked these questions of you in the last hour and a half. But I'm sure you'll appreciate we regard these, as you do, as you said in your letter, as very serious matters. And I think there is the feeling of the committee that the first review was not satisfactory in this sense. It's not a question of good faith or your choice of investigator, though we don't know who that is. but there seems to be a number of items that still need to be chased up in respect of the first review, and we welcome the fact that there is a second review. Some people don't like reviews into reviews, because we've seen this with phone hacking. The John Yates review lasted, I think, a couple of hours. This is going to last a much longer time, and it's going to be independent. We welcome this. In respect of Lady Butler Schloss, a very distinguished a person that has been appointed, is there any concerns that you had before the appointment was made that she was actually a member of the upper house, and some of the allegations may have been made about members of this house? Was that considered at all, despite the fact that she's extraordinarily distinguished and a very good head of the family division, that she is a member of Parliament and she is very closely related to a former Lord Chancellor?
The short answer, Mr. Chairman, is no. She's a woman of unimpeachable integrity. She's a crossbench peer, of course, so is also highly independent in the House of Lords, and I think anyone who's ever dealt with her wouldn't question for a second the integrity, capability, intelligence and rigour that she will bring to this.
I agree with you, and I just put that to you. Finally, could you let us have the following, just to remind you, just in case your note takers did not write these down, and not that I'm casting any aspersions on your current crop of note takers. We would like you to look at that list, the titles of the 114 files. I actually think it should have been done last year, but we'll give you the benefit of the doubt, and have a look at them, and if you're able to share it with this committee, we would like to see a copy of that list, please. We would like a redacted copy of the report as soon as possible. You want to perhaps wait for the inquiry to look into this, but we will expect a reply on this if you feel that's the case. We would like a list not of the names of members of staff of the Home Office who have been dismissed for unauthorised disposal of files. We'd like the numbers, please, since 1979. And we would like to know, in answer to Mr. Austin's questions, the ministers who signed off the VSU expenditure. We would like all that by noon on Friday.
Mr. Chairman, we'll provide all of that we can, where we still have the records, of course. You recognise some of this is a long time ago, but of course I'll do my best to provide you with all that information, or information that is relevant to it if we can't find the specifics. But we'll do our absolute best.
We as a committee are very grateful to you for the letter that you sent us, for coming here today, and for answering questions in a very open and transparent way.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. I appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you. Order, order.